I'm Sanjay Jolly, direct the program in law and political economy here at Harvard Law School. I'm very excited for today's session of Supply Chain Capitalism, legal regimes and worker power. So just a quick recap, because it's been a little while since we met on this series. So we started off in early February with Hila Shamir discussing a new labor law for supply chain capitalism. Sort of very big picture and a very expansive view of reframing labor law for thinking about global supply chains and global value chains. And then a week after that, we had Vivian Price, whose film Talking Union, Talking Climate discussed the just transition and various sort of points in oil supply chains between California, Norway, and the Nigerian Delta. And so we're sort of shifting again, sticking with this sort of international view and how law structures social relations in global supply chains, with a focus today with Professor Desiree LeClercq on global trade regimes. So today's discussion will be moderated by SJD candidate and LPE extraordinaire, Dana Zuk. And so Dana will kick us off. We'll hear from Desiree. There'll be some sort of moderated questions from Dana, and then we'll take questions both from the folks here in the room and on Zoom via the chat function. So with that, I will hand it off to Dana.
Thanks, Sanjay, and thanks everyone for coming. So I'm really happy to have here Desiree LeClercq. She's an assistant professor at Cornell University's School of Industrial and Labor Relations and affiliated faculty at the Cornell Law School. She teaches international labor law, US labor law, and employment law. Her research places marginalized workers at the center of global and economic policies. In addition to research, she frequently consults with policymakers concerning trade policy and its effects on formal and informal sector workers. The European Commission has included her in its pool of candidates eligible to chair disputes arising under the trade and sustainability chapters of EU trade agreements. Before joining the ILR school, she was a director for labor affairs at the USTR, and before that, she was a legal officer for the International Labor Organization in Geneva. And the stage is yours.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay with this mic? Okay, so while I'm talking, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. It's always the hardest thing that I do in a presentation. Can everyone know? Yes, okay. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you to Sanjay, to Dana, and to Hila for the kind invitation to be here. So as is mentioned, I come at these issues a little bit differently from a lot of academics. And the reason why is because when I graduated from law school, I didn't go straight into academia. I spent 15 years, as Dana alludes to, in practice. So the first thing I did, and the reason why I'm giving you a brief rundown of this is I want to make sure we all know what agencies I'm referring to in the acronyms before I build off of that. I know a lot of you are familiar with this, but I want to just make sure we're all on the same level. So the first job that I had out of law school was I was the staff attorney to the chairman of the National Labor Relations Board. That is the federal agency kind of delegated with responsibilities to enforce the National Labor Relations Act. In that capacity, this was the Bush board, and I would join the chairman and the other 4 board members in closed doors proceedings to decide issues of representation and unit and bargaining and collective bargaining and the like, and then we would draft up the decisions. After 4 years of that, I got really bored with US labor law and the way that it encroached on the rights of US workers. And so I took a job at the International Labor Organization, the ILO in Geneva, Switzerland. There, it was a really interesting kind of paradigm shift. Rather than the government making all decisions on behalf of the workers, the ILO operates on a tripartite basis, meaning it takes all decisions and open consultations with representatives of workers, employers, and governments, all reaching consensus before moving on. And the reason why that is important to today's discussion, well, it's important for a number of reasons, as you'll see, But one of those reasons involves the term worker power. So worker power is a part of my presentation. It's a term that we use a lot, frequently in fact, as a goal of labor law. But I think we often don't always agree on what that means. So when a lot of people say worker power, what they're thinking is, oh, we've got to be able to get to the table and make demands. We've got to be strong. We've got to, get workers to push out capitalism and reap really strong rewards. At the ILO, what worker power means is inclusion in a sustainable fashion, meaning that workers will be there, but that whatever terms are agreed upon at that time can actually engender compliance, participation, and realistic expectations. So for example, one of the instruments that I worked on was the minimum wage machinery convention. I'd go into a country to help them on behalf of the ILO, and the government would say to me, what should our minimum wage be? I really want to be in compliance with this ILO convention. You tell me the number and I'll legislate it. And my response to them was, that would actually violate your commitments under this convention. I cannot give you that number because I would be stepping on the toes of workers. Only workers can tell you what they need to be able to live, and only employers then can tell you what they can afford to pay without going out of business. It is only through those tripartite discussions that you can reach the minimum wage, and it's my job to make sure that that machinery is running and enforced. So that is the premise of the ILO and its tripartism and its definition of worker power that has heavily influenced the way that I think about these issues. Now, while I was at the ILO, I was also getting really depressed, not because governments were taking over the world, but because governments don't care about the ILO. And what I mean by that is the ILO doesn't have a sanctions mechanism. It cannot hit governments where it hurts. It cannot drive compliance always. Sure, it gets far in these tripartite consultations and these kind of consensual discussions, but at the end of the day, governments have a lot of different interests, and satisfying their international commitments is one of them, but it certainly isn't going to always rule the day. While I was there, I started studying trade agreements. There was this new phenomena starting in the 90s where governments were incorporating the ILO's instruments by reference into their trade agreements. And that was really interesting to me because now we're talking sanctions. Now we're talking market access. Now we're talking in a language that governments cared about. So I started focusing kind of my voluntary efforts on this and meeting with the US government when it would come through. And because of that, when the Obama administration needed a trade negotiator for the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, they recruited me. So I left the ILO and I joined the Obama administration in April 2016, which was very bad timing. I thought it was me working for the first woman president. I did not work for the first woman president, but I did stick around for 4 years during the Trump administration. I joined many of us who felt like we could do better work from the inside. We could do more mitigating the problems than what would happen if we jumped ship. And I'm proud of the work we did. There were tons of things you will never hear about because they never happened. And the reason why they never happened is because you had people behind the scenes making sure that the damage was not worse than it really was. But then of course I got depressing too, so then I joined academia. But anyway, so here I am today in front of you. The reason why the practical experience is important is because one of the premises I want to attack right now in this discussion is the difference between theory and practice. So as law students, we always get taught theory, right? Back in my day, we were taught this really, really ridiculous theory that governments were rational actors that made monolithic decisions based on costs and benefits, right? It's called law and economics. If anyone here is still a law and economics scholar, please meet me afterwards and we'll talk about that. Nowadays, one of the big popular theories is one about neoliberalism. So neoliberalism is kind of an indeterminate concept. So we don't fully know what it means, but we know what we think about it, right? If you're talking about a neoliberal policy, you're expressing a normative claim, right? We don't tend to look at policies and say they're neoliberal if we like them. We tend to talk about neoliberal policies to express a judgment against the values that that policy expresses about markets and about capital. Because we think neoliberal policies are the problem, we consider that as the cause of a decline in worker power. So neoliberal policies like trade, eclipse worker voice, and undermine worker power. Because that is the problem, when we think about a solution, we think about undoing neoliberalism. If we only got rid of neoliberalism, we could have worker power. So to that end, if you listen to what the Biden administration says, quite often tries to distance itself from neoliberalism. It says, we're the most pro-union administration you've ever seen because we're not neoliberal. So they've manufactured a foil. And because it's manufactured this foil, its policies in juxtaposition have looked really positive. That's not how I see things. In fact, I think that the foil and the narrative and the subsequent policies are reifying the very problems that undermine worker power, and that's why I'm here today. So in short, here's how I see the problem. I think workers don't have power because they're excluded from the tables that identify and distribute that power. I think if we do away with their exclusion, in other words, if we find ways of including them, we can give workers a chance. We can give workers a voice in these policies. And then, and somewhat controversially, I like to conclude that neoliberal policies like trade agreements are the perfect avenue for that correction. In other words, it's these very neoliberal policies that are going to give us the worker power that is missing. And so, with that, let's start. But so one quick caveat. I learned last night at dinner that this is a complex issue that might bring up emotions. And so I see this as kind of like a Lego, when you build a really big Lego and you have to get all the pieces. So last night I started with like the shoulder, and because I didn't start with the feet, the whole thing kind of tumbled. So I'm gonna take my time today and try to really start with the feet. But so I know that what Sanjay and everybody said is like, hold your questions to the end. And if you wanna argue with me, like let's fight it out at the end. But I want you all to build your Legos with me. And if you find yourself missing a tibia, and I've moved on, I want you to raise your hand and I want you to bring me back to the tibia. Because whether you agree with me or not, I want you to understand what I'm trying to say. That's my ultimate goal, okay? All right, so let's get started. Here's the quick rundown. First, I'm gonna briefly talk to you about the history of neoliberalism as I see it. And it's in stark contrast to the theory of neoliberalism as you've been taught it. Second, I'm gonna talk about how the Biden administration has reified the very procedural defects that we've seen historically. And then finally, I'm gonna talk to you about the future and how I see trade agreements as the future for enhancing worker power. So what is neoliberalism? I just got back from a conference in Yale, as I was telling some people, and the whole conference was about what is neoliberalism. And you have all of these really, really smart people who do nothing but talk about neoliberalism. And they had no idea what neoliberalism was. They all sat around, well, maybe it's like a feeling, maybe it's a sentiment, maybe it's, nobody could really, so here's in general though, here's the theory of neoliberalism as we are taught in the abstract. So we're taught that it's a political ideology. And by that I mean we're taught that the role of the state should be reduced to creating an enabling environment for the market. Right? So the role of the state is simply enable capitalism, enable free markets, and then step away. Remove your discretion and allow the market to market. That's one of the fundamental features of neoliberalism in the abstract. It's also a global order. So the government in this reduced capacity should do things like enter into trade agreements, which will liberalize trade, which will liberalize global markets, and then should, again, stay out of it, right? And then finally, as a state policy, so to the extent that states do create anything beyond that enabling right, we should look very skeptically at it because there is this embedded belief that states are vulnerable to capture. So to the extent that states meddle in the market, they're actually articulating an interest that has captured them. So this all kind of reinforces this notion under neoliberalism in the abstract of states being this very, very hands-off, creating a paradigm and then stepping out of it. Already, by the way, you should be feeling a little uncomfortable because if you are familiar with US policies and US history, the idea of a US president deciding, volunteering to withhold its power and to stay out of policies is fiction, or at least it's the fiction that I saw. So let's go to reality. I'm gonna pause and tell you guys a funny story. I made this on PowerPoint, and all of these, so the 2 pictures of Bush came straight up under AI. Every single time I tried to get a picture of Bill Clinton, it told me that it was, like, it offended the morals of the program. So I tried William Clinton, I tried Bill Clinton, I tried Hillary Clinton, and finally I was like, okay, just give me every US president. I'll be damned. It gave me every US president except for Bill Clinton. So I had to go online, so that's why it looks all funny. Anyways, so let's just look at the policies of our presidents during kind of key neoliberal time. Now, if our abstract theory of neoliberalism and its evils were true, we should see that these presidents had a very hands-off approach to the markets, had a very hands-off approach to anything affecting the competition between labor and capital and the like, should the abstract of neoliberalism be true. So I just took 2 kind of examples. The reason why I chose these 2 is that these are the 2 I know the best. So you have the National Labor Relations Act and you have trade agreements. And I just want us to think about these 2 within the framework of those neoliberal presidents. So the National Labor Relations Act, the way that I see it, is the paradigmatic neoliberal exercise. What I mean by that is if you take it seriously, if you take Section 7 and its promises seriously, what it says is that the role of the government is to set up the conditions, is to create the playground rules, freedom to associate, non-interference, and the like. Allow workers to aggregate. The moment they do, the moment that they decide that there's an election or the like, once it comes time to bargain, the government stays out of it. So the NLRB, for example, would not fix wages in a collective bargaining agreement. It would not be up to the NLRB to decide whether or not the result of the bargaining, so long as the conditions were correct, should somehow be null and void. That's not the NLRB's policing job. The NLRB's job is to ensure that the market of competition is fair, that no one has cheated, and then it stays out of it. And that to me is as close in the abstract as it was to the abstract theory of neoliberalism. So what actually happened? Well, if you are a labor law aficionado and you've followed the flip-flopping of NLRB decisions across our different presidential administrations, you see that that wasn't the case. We've always had an interventionist government when it comes to labor law. And what I mean by that is we've had a government that has interfered actively with the rights of workers to join unions. We have not allowed the market to play out. We have not allowed labor to truly combine and countervail capital. The way that the boards have interfered with that is they, for instance, have allowed employers to fire workers trying to form unions. Already? Oh geez, I better hurry up. Okay, so the board, and ask me if you have questions about this later, if you want to find about whether the board was interventionist, but I think we can probably agree that the NLRB has been pretty active in preventing workers from organizing. Trade agreements are other quintessential neoliberal project, right? In fact, when we were talking about the global order, presidents are supposed to liberalize trade, and that is a sign of the market beating, labor. That is not what has happened. Bob Lighthizer, President Trump's Office of U.S. Trade Representative Ambassador, just wrote a book about how no trade has ever been free trade, and he is 100% right. So U.S. presidents have always imposed tariffs, which are effectively taxes, on imports. They have always manipulated the market. And the reason why they have, very much as the reason the NLRB has intervened, is because they have been playing to specific interests. So it is not that they have just this unrooted love for free markets. They have had a loyalty, a fealty, a seat at the table for capital. It's not that capital has run its course naturally. It is that the government has intervened and invited it to the table. And because it has invited it to the table and it has not invited workers to the table, certain preferences have been made. What do I mean by that? Trade agreements, the Bush administration imposed really high steel tariffs. Now it did so in order to help the steel sector, including the steel union workers. Lydia Cox just recently did a study to see what were the long-term effects of these steel tariffs in trade on workers in the United States, noting that for every one job in the steel sector, there are 80 jobs downstream. So those are 80 workers to every one worker advantaged by the steel sector. She found that downstream workers were significantly undermined by those steel tariffs. As the price of steel went up, the downstream enterprises suffered. They couldn't get export opportunities because other countries were so pissed off they were no longer importing. And all of a sudden, the wages that they were getting were suffering from the overly inflated costs of steel. So this, by the way, in conclusion, was not what our theory would give us. US administrators never relinquished control. Instead, they exercised a plutocracy. They exercised specific interests where some were invited to the table, others were not, and those who were excluded were disadvantaged significantly. So look at today. We have a president who openly embraces capitalism, right? He comes out, he's very proud of himself for that. But he caveats it by saying his version of capitalism is going to be different from other people's capitalism because he's going to listen to workers. He's going to have an interest group. Here we have the Office of the US Trade Representative's work policy agenda. They put these out every year. What was interesting to me is their take on their approach to labor rights. So as I mentioned earlier, trade agreements have labor chapters. Those labor chapters are negotiated instruments between Congress, President, and our foreign actor partners. What they are promising here is they say trade partners should compete on the merits, not on the basis of exploitation. What's important there is the understanding of a shift that is happening, where the rights of workers are important in trade, are important to our markets, not for the sake of workers, but for the sake of our markets. We should protect the rights of workers in our trade agreements, not because we're of some altruistic global exercise, but because we care about the conditions of competition. This is neoliberalism. But not necessarily neoliberalism in its theory, because as I've said, neoliberalism in its theory has never existed. This is neoliberalism in practice. How so? Because this is a president taking an interest, inviting that interest to the table, and then articulating that interest in its market-based policies. You still have exclusions. You still have some invited to the table and not others. Under the National Labor Relations Act, as I said before, I think the Biden administration has done a number of good things for workers, and I'm not here to dispute that. However, I think that it still allows the National Labor Relations Board to meddle with union representation and organizing far more than it should. It still allows certain employer justifications to outweigh the rights of workers when they're trying to, for example, contest and aggregate at the workplace. With trade agreements, there's a labor advisory council that the Biden administration inherited from the Trump administration before those. It has a labor advisory council. The only people invited are big unions. They're the only people invited to that table. You don't have informal workers. You don't have non-union workers. You don't have workers of small sectors. You only have the big unions opining on trade agreements before those trade agreements are negotiated and enforced. So as a result, we still have a number of inequities that we don't need to have, but we do. So for example, we don't have a paradigm that supports non-union workers. We have 130 million non-union workers in America. Some of them, sure, are just like jerks and they don't want to be parts of unions. A lot of them are not members of unions for no fault of their own. They're in right-to-work states. They get fired for being disloyal, or they get fired for being uncivil. They get fired for a number of reasons, and our National Labor Relations Board has yet to craft a doctrine that adequately preserves their rights to join and organize. Home workers, our good friend Yaron Zhang likes to write about home workers and how there still is no legal paradigm equipped to protect them, to visibilize them, to allow them a seat at the table. Export sector workers, as I mentioned, every time you hear the Biden administration talk about steel and manufacturing, every time you see that they're adjusting market policies, understand that there are other sectors of workers that take the costs of those measures. Those are typically export sector workers that are losing their export opportunities as our countries, our trade partners, are increasingly pissed off. Informal workers in the United States are not represented by unions. If they're not represented by unions, they have no voice at these tables. Immigrant workers, same. The National Labor Relations Act embedded long racialized disparities about what workers will be included and excluded. and organizing and forming unions. So we have domestic workers, agricultural workers, and a whole host of workers that have been excluded, sometimes to their benefit, right? Because it allows the state to protect them. But when we talk about federal policies, it's to their detriment. And then finally, something that I feel very strongly about are workers in other countries. We talk about global supply chains. We talk about allowing workers an opportunity to build themselves out of poverty, a poverty that the United States placed them in decades and decades ago. Every time we remove these trade opportunities and we close our markets, we are depriving those workers an opportunity to build better. The Biden administration has refused to enter into a single trade agreement since it came into their office. All right, so what's the takeaway? The takeaway is that the Biden administration hasn't let go of control any more than the other administrations have let go of control to allow the market. It has not allowed labor to fight with capital. Labor still is not allowed to aggregate in the way that capital can aggregate. Only certain workers are invited to the table, and those are wonderful, hardworking union workers, but they're not representing the interests of non-union workers who are not invited to that table. It's not always a zero-sum game, but it's sometimes a zero-sum game. We're still in the process of plutocracy. So then let's talk about, okay, what are we gonna do? And I have like 1 minute, so I'm gonna do this really quickly. How can we talk about what worker power is? In my view, it's about inclusion. It's about getting them a seat at that table. And in that sense, I do draw heavily from my ILO experiences, from this idea of tripartism, from this idea of including the voices who will be affected, making sure that it's not just aggressive power, but that it is a sustainable power, that it is a voice capable of achieving change. That's what I've been thinking about. In trade agreements, what's really interesting about them is that they take a sectoral approach. So the one agreement that the Trump administration negotiated that Biden has inherited is NAFTA 2.0, USMCA. USMCA identifies trade priority sectors, and it treats those sectors as homogenous. So for example, under USMCA, it's very interested in the auto sector and the really horrible unions that were pretending to represent workers in Mexico. Taking a sectoral approach, the United States, the ILO, and Mexico bargained, came up with a strong list of robust protections, required all of the corporate unions in Mexico to hold new election campaigns, and crafted kind of a worker-driven enforcement policy that allows unions and workers to prompt petitions. It's an imperfect system, I complain about it all the time, but it nevertheless gives us an example of how through trade agreements, the United States siloed interest-driven approach might be replaced by something new, something better, something not so encased in the plutocracy that the United States alone finds itself. Another thing that we can think about is how workers that are otherwise excluded under US labor laws can be included there. So through trade agreements, you can be more creative. You can talk about home workers as offering a competitive advantage to those who need to be able to leave the house and make a living. The ILO has reports showing the relationship between home workers, domestic workers, and profits and wages. If we can think strategically about using these stories, using these exclusions as market germane factors, as things that give countries competitive advantages, give us a competitive advantage. If we learn how to speak in the narratives of governmental policies, I think what we're already seeing in trade agreements is greater flexibility to bring these types of excluded sectors or workers to the table based on their sector. So like all auto workers, whether informal or not, all agricultural workers, right? You would bring the agricultural workers, formal or informal, you would bring their representatives in any effect. You would have them at the table to bargain with the employers and the governments, the outcomes of which would be codified in the trade agreement. So basically, by using the United States interests in markets and its interests in capital, we can craft a new bargaining system that allows workers to come to the table, that with employers and governments, to ensure that what trade agreements are really doing is allowing labor to combine and to push against capital, if that makes any sense. All right, so I'm going to conclude there. Oh yes, I'm right on time, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Desiree. It was super interesting, and I'm sure that many people here have lots of questions. But before that, I would like to discuss with you 3 points that captured my attention during your presentation. So the first one is about neoliberalism, where you started your presentation. So what I take out from you is that you say that neoliberalism is indeterminate. That is to say that, contrary to what some of us might think, neoliberalism is not a coherent set of policies or a coherent technocratic economic agenda. Rather, I think that what you want to imply is that neoliberal discourse has been deployed by politicians and policymakers in a strategic, sometimes inconsistent way to advance certain political results. Now, you say that pro-labor activists should work within the neoliberalism, or maybe we should say re-signify neoliberalism to advance our goals. And the question, I think, is whether it is a strategic or an opportunistic, not in a bad sense, move, or do you really think that there is such a stable thing like neoliberalism and that it can encompass policies that have the potential to empower workers?
Wow, I should get you to write my paper for me, I like that. All right, so the way that I look at it, at least, neoliberalism with respect to labor and capital, we don't know who would win, labor versus capital, because we've never seen an unfettered labor aggregate. All we've ever seen is efforts by workers to join and efforts by governments to keep them from doing so, right? And employers. I mean, governments are certainly not fully responsible. So what I'm trying to urge is a new paradigm where the countervailing forces actually get to countervail, where our original romantic, perhaps, vision of a labor paradigm can actually be realized. And I think that by packaging this as something for governments and a governmental interest will get us much further. And I'll give you an example. I was saying this last night at dinner, so for those of you who were there, you go to sleep. When I was at USTR, there were a lot of feminist movements that would come to us, and they were asking for us to put a chapter in the USMCA for women's rights. And the Trump administration just laughed because their packaging was wrong. They came to the administration and they said, trade should care about women because that's the right thing to do. And the Trump administration wasn't exactly convinced by that, right? So at the time, I proposed, and a number of us have been thinking about, how do we repackage this to say, instead of trade should care about women because that's the right thing to do, to trade should care about women's rights because those countries that undermine women's rights are gaining a competitive advantage. They don't have to pay their women the same salaries. They don't have to offer their women the same types of health benefits, nursing rooms, and the like. And because they get to basically build off of the rights of women, subordinate women the way that they are, the goods that are produced in their factories are produced unfairly, and then they compete with ours, and we're a country that respects more or less some of these things. So the moment that it was recrafted as an issue that was germane to the conditions of trade, the moment it started getting a lot of traction. And now, as you'll see, the USTR often includes women's provisions. Since then, women's chapters have been incorporated in trade agreements, and it's become a real active part of the trade narrative. Not because women always deserve our parochial protections, but rather because it was finally understood that permitting other trade partners to derogate the rights of women actually gave them a competitive disadvantage. And so what I'm trying to say is take this one example and start looking more broadly at how we can use this pathway to completely redefining who gets a seat at the table. And if we can start saying, well, USTR was, under USMCA it was autos, right? And a lot of these trade agreements, it's agriculture, it's sugar, it's plantations. And if you can start looking at it sectorally with a market purpose, you're gonna get taken a lot more seriously than if you sit down with the government and say, we need to care about workers because they're human beings and because we should. Yes, that's right, of course that's right, but that's always been right and that's never won the day.
Thank you. So let's talk about trade and protectionism. So here again, what I understand from you is that enhancing free trade, whatever that means, has the potential to empower workers globally, and specifically you refer to marginalized workers, right? So usually when we talk about free trade, we talk about free flow of capital, free flow of goods, and free flow of labor. Now, there are, as of today, proposals on the table to work within the current framework of free trade to advance, for example, free flow of labor while limiting the free flow of capital. And this is, for example, Roberto Unger's proposal. And just today, I read of a new book suggesting that we should learn from left efforts in the 19th century to advance commercial peace through free trade in order to carve out untaken roads for left free trade agenda. But as I see it, the problem with these proposals is not that they're aspirational. It's that they're aspirational, and they're so not because they're not comprehensive enough, but because they don't really address the real causes of trade agenda, including protectionism, which is the national political class-based coalition that supports any trade agenda, many times when it comes in tandem with certain welfare agenda to stabilize the internal political detrimental results of free trade, right? So this is, for example, the point of Polanyi and more recently Robert Brenner. And both state that the US has never deployed a real free trade agenda. So the question is how we can advance such a pro-free trade agenda without really accounting for the national political class-based coalition that would back it in the ballot box.
No, that's an excellent question. So a project that I did a few years ago was looking at protectionism and what we mean by that. And there's actually various forms of protection. So if you think about it, the most well-known form of trade protectionism is what I've been talking about so far, and what Dana just mentioned, which is, all right, let's protect the steel industry from imports, and we'll do that by raising tariffs, or let's protect manufacturing by limiting how many manufactured goods can come into this country. But there's another form of protectionism as well, and that's labor protectionism. So it's going to look the exact same, but the story is a little different. So it goes a little something like this. Instead of allowing cheap goods to come in to protect our corporations, let's not allow cheap goods to come in because we want to protect our workers, right? We don't want the sucking sound of companies going into Mexico. We don't want to lose our good jobs. We are America. We care, USA. We care about America's workers, and that's also a form of protectionism that has driven the U.S. trade agenda, depending on who's sitting at the table. So often when we have Republican presidents, it's the corporate protectionism, and right now that we have Biden, it's the union protectionism. But the result is the exact same. And that is protectionist policies, which is why Bob Lighthizer noted astutely that we've never had free trade, and as you note, the same. And the question becomes if we've never had it before, what makes us think, here we are being pragmatists today, that we're going to wake up tomorrow and be able to sell this politically? Did I understand your question correctly?
Yes, sort of. I think that the problem at the end is that if you really believe that free trade is detrimental to the internal economic system and also to internal politics, you need to form a solid political coalition on the national level to support it, not just on moral premises, but on real economic interests.
Yeah, so the problem is that ideology and theory have all been intertwined. So I'm a pro-labor person and I talk about trade, and I get accused all the time of not really being a pro-labor person because I'm in favor of trade, right? We've created this fictional narrative that there's two sides, and if you care about human beings, you hate neoliberalism, right? Going back to our theoretical discussion, and trade is neoliberalism, so you can't like trade if you like workers. And that is so embedded in our national discourse that you see members of Congress and you see advocates really aligning based on this polarity, and as a result of that, missing the critical opportunities that exist in trade. And what do we do about going to fix that? Usually when we want to push back on a false ideology, we do so through data, right? But it's really, really hard when the bodies responsible for accumulating the data have every interest in limiting that data. So I'll give you an example. Under the Biden administration, USTR commissioned this huge report about the effects of trade liberalization on workers and marginalized groups. And it was really exciting to a lot of us because it was supposed to show what happens when you open your borders to workers and Black workers and brown workers and informal workers, and it was going to answer all of these questions. And instead what they did is they isolated the report to only looking at the dangers of trade liberalization. They included no information about protectionism, and they included no information about the advantages to export sector workers. So they announced this huge big study, and then they completely restricted the scope of it to only accepting information that would support their anti-liberalization agenda. So it is really, really difficult when you rely on the government to produce the information that it would need to undermine its own efforts and constituency groups. And this again also goes as to the dangers of plutocracy. So the Biden administration has a very clear interest group and constituency. It is big unions, the same big unions that are most supported by the very protectionist policies that you see. It is not the unions that are down, or workers that are downstream of these policies. Those workers are not invited to the Biden administration's table. Those workers cannot cumulatively support the Biden administration's campaign and the like, right? There's a whole kind of paradigm here. So in order for the Biden administration to take seriously the opportunities of trade, they'd have to really put some kind of risk, right? But here's my counterpoint. There's 130 million non-union workers in America, and they've got to vote for somebody. Why not start seeing the advantages of the constituencies and start seeing the advantages to those workers that are not otherwise represented or invited to the table? So basically, we have to start offering this information notwithstanding. We have to make it loud. Right now, the Biden administration has crafted a foil of neoliberalism, but that only works if we let that work, if we accept that narrative, if we give them the high five, right? And I'm not saying don't vote for him, okay? I want to be very, very clear about that. I'm not saying do not vote for Biden and vote for the other guy. That is certainly not the point here, but the point is, if we want to hold a president accountable, we ourselves have to resist that narrative, and we have to demand something a lot better.
Thank you. So lastly, and then we will open the conversation. So I want to talk about your critique of unions. And I think that you have a valid point here about the costs and benefits of unions. And this is something that goes all the way back to the 19th century, right? When newcomers, immigrants, workers, they looted the power of more skilled workers in the trade organization. But the question for me, I think, is not about enhancing the autonomy of certain workers or groups of workers, but how can we create a stable structure that empowers workers vis-a-vis capital? And here your proposal about focusing about mechanisms and participation and institutional change. So I'm not sure, considering the past and our experience with the NLRB, that we won't end up again with another labor washing, or as Carl Clare puts it, in another mechanism that kind of legitimates and justifies domination and hierarchies within the workplace?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I agree a lot with it. I mean, to be clear, I think that unions are critical, and we're better with unions than we are without them. I think that the way that we have a union structure in the United States creates unnecessarily a hierarchy with majority representation and exclusions out of the NLRA. But the question becomes, how do we craft something better, right? Is this inevitable? Every time we talk about labor, we're going to be anchored to hierarchies and misrepresentation or underrepresentation. And it's hard to answer that because I'm a pragmatist and I've never seen a better model, but for what happens at the ILO. So the ILO does not require majority representation. You can have 100 different unions in one factory, right? It does not look under the hood, but it nevertheless has certain protections in place. So you can have 100 unions, but those unions better represent their workers. If it's a corporate union, like we talked about last night, if it, is a fake union, if it is somehow not offering that duty of loyalty to its members, then that's not going to be represented by the ILO as somebody worthy of sitting at that table. So while there are not these fictional divisions in place, it's always struck me as ironic that our labor law that's supposed to aggregate workers has actually done more to divide them. But we almost, if we get ourselves out of this NLRA paradigm and we start looking about it as an international issue, which kind of frees up this policy space a little bit, then we can envision a system more like the ILO's, where you can have multiple representations of various sectors of workers, so long as they're actually representational. Will there be hierarchies? Yes. I have yet to see any type of social order, whether it be labor, whether it be capital, whether it be anything that doesn't fall to some form of hierarchical tension. But that is more under the hood than I think we need to go right now. I think right now it's sufficient to say, if we can move to this sectoral approach through bargaining and trade agreements, then we can already give workers a greater voice and an opportunity to create sustainable and lasting change, which again satisfies what I'm thinking of when I'm thinking of worker power.
Thank you. Sanjay, can we open?
Yeah.
Perfect. Nida, yes.
Thank you so much for an excellent and great talk. So I have kind of like two questions about inclusion and like the concept of inclusion, because I'm also like all sort of like big on it. But first of all, when we're talking about like inclusion via trade agreements, what type of standards are we talking about? Like, for example, would it cover anti-discrimination protections, or is it like a voluntary bargaining process where it's more of a procedural benefit that workers get? And the second question is, again, when we talk about inclusion, what's the type of inclusion we're striving for? Like, is it the broader concept of social inclusion, or a bit narrower of like inclusion in the standards and like in the scope of the rights and protections? Or are we talking very specifically about inclusion in the trade agreement sort of like process in terms of voice, but then this can end up becoming like a rubber stamping exercise, and how do we like prevent that in the next stage of like the process?
Okay, thank you. All really good questions. The first one is easier to answer than the second. So right now what trade, and I didn't have time to give you guys like a 101 on trade and labor, but the short of it is trade agreements are very specific about what standards they're going to care about. And what they care about are the 5 what are considered fundamental labor rights. So the first is freedom of association and collective bargaining. Those are considered the enabling rights. You have to have those before any of these other rights become relevant. The other is non-discrimination, as you mentioned. The other is prohibitions against child labor. The other is prohibitions against forced labor. And then as amended in 2022, finally, we're talking occupational safety and health. So these are like the big buckets of rights that trade agreements care about. And why that's interesting is because it incorporates the ILO's emphasis on freedom of association as the enabling right. And so that already gets us to the procedures necessary for the more substantive rights to come into existence, right? It doesn't busy itself, kind of like what the NLRA and the others are supposed to do. It doesn't worry about what were the outcomes of the consultations. What it cares about are that the consultations take place. So like my minimum wage anecdote at the beginning of this story, right? We would care about getting them to the table so long as they came to an agreement, that would become the point of reference. Now, as far as how do we protect against rubber stamping, I mean, this is still something we're all learning about, and different, whether it's a worker center or a union. How do we ensure that there's robust participation, right? As a thought experiment in another paper I wrote about what would this paradigm look like if the United States were to enter into a trade agreement with Côte d'Ivoire. So one of the big issues there is we import a lot of sugar from Côte d'Ivoire, and there are a number of child labor issues in that country. So the ILO's come out and said your minimum age is way too low. And the United States hasn't cared, even though we're importing all these. So if we actually did a trade agreement, one of the sectors that would be involved in bargaining based on our own trade relationships would be the plantations, would be those sectors. And representatives of those sectors would be at the trade table to discuss and bargain over the conditions that would then be incorporated in the trade agreement. That would be one way of addressing the issue of child labor that the ILO has otherwise been unable to motivate in that country. Now, how do we ensure that unions aren't going to somehow undermine the rights of children in these discussions? How do we ensure that children's rights are adequately represented at that table? That's probably a discussion for a whole other luncheon with its own complex issues to address. But let me just leave it at this. They're already getting much further with the invitation through sectoral bargaining and this paradigm than they are with the status quo ILO. And so already through these types of mechanisms, we're bringing accountability and we're also bringing more to the table, but for the trade agreement.
I have a quick question from the chat from Amit Shamesh. What do you think about class actions as a tool to battle unfair capitalism and its impact on employees?
So that would be domestically and outside of trade?
I'm not sure.
Okay, so look, anytime, and this is kind of the broad theme of this, anytime that you can get an actual aggregate force of resistance, I think that we're doing better. So is this through strategic litigation? You've got me, I'd love to see it. I think that would be an interesting development that isn't foreclosed. I think that to the extent that we can combine our interests and push back against otherwise kind of the capitalistic powers, I think is better, but is it a sure-all? No. We've certainly seen this tried and failed in the past.
Other questions from the audience here? Yeah.
Thank you, Desiree. This was very interesting. I would love to hear you talk more about the USMCA. You didn't have a lot of time to discuss it here. For many studying labor, it seems like a really innovative strategy, and many, including you, some I would say, including you, have been criticizing it. And I wonder if you can talk about a little bit in the paradigm that you suggested now, including the kind of, you gave it here as a good example.
Yeah.
But you have all this criticism, so
right.
If you can kind of expand on that.
Yeah, USMCA is hard for me because it is the best example of a step. But I do always want to make sure that we understand that it's a work in progress. So the way that what Gila's referencing, there's a new mechanism under the USMCA, NAFTA 2.0, which was negotiated by the Trump administration. So already there should be like little bells going off. It has a specific enforcement mechanism called the rapid response mechanism. What's interesting about this, so it's sectoral. This is only about priority sectors, namely auto workers and other areas of trade with Mexico. What's cool about it is that workers trigger it. So workers in Mexico, unions in Mexico, use the petitions process established under the trade agreement to initiate action by the United States. So this, when we're talking about worker power and like how can these trade agreements actually foster real leverage by collective workers, that's as far as I'm willing to give the USMCA credit. Why it aggravates me is because there's no transparency. Ultimately, the decision to get initiated. So like workers can use this petition, they use all of their resources to gather this evidence to send to the United States. Then behind closed doors, without any accountability, judicial review, or transparency or due process, USTR makes a decision on whether or not to follow up with that petition. So some incite action, and those have been fabulous. So USTR goes like gunning into Mexico and goes into the facilities and threatens to remove market advantages, and it's rendered great results. So we've gotten rid of corporate unions, new unions, independent unions have come in, wages have gone up, workers have been really happy. But there have also been a number of cases where for inexplicable reasons, because the government doesn't share, USTR has declined to take petitions. So unions use all of these resources that they don't have to try to initiate proceedings, and for no reason, USTR decides not to take the action. So this is government intervention. This is the type of stuff I've been talking about, where it's not the government allowing the market forces to be. If that were the case, it would look into all of these petitions. It would allow workers to actually contest capital, and instead there is something else going on. I don't know what that something else is because USTR hasn't told me. I am doing an empirical project in Mexico because I'm really tired of people telling me what Mexican workers think. So I'm actually doing a project that asks them, okay, you're at a facility in Mexico. Since USMCA, do you feel like your needs have been heard by your union? Do you feel like you have an independent union? If you don't, do you feel like you could use this mechanism to your advantage? Do you appreciate USTR's policing presence, or does that make you uncomfortable? These types of questions. So it's still preliminary to talk about the results, but I can tell you already, it's not nearly as black and white as the theory would have us think. So I think it's a good case, a good model to show, okay, trade agreements can actually do pretty cool things. It can allow sectoral bargaining, it can correct corporate unions, it can give workers a voice on the ground and really incite change and leverage. But we do have to make sure that governments do what governments never want to do, which is actually keep the geopolitics out of it, keep the plutocracy out of it, and allow the forces to countervail.
So I wanted to ask you about this sort of concept of seat at the table.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to underlie a lot of the sort of theory of power around this project. So I understand a part of what you're saying as that there's untapped opportunity within to actually harness neoliberal discourse to make pro-worker arguments through sort of reframing worker struggle in terms of competition and market inclusion. And so I think on one hand, so if you get this sort of broader representation of the working class in the sort of 1/3 of the ILO that represents them, what happens then, right? I mean, is it, because I think on one hand there's a sort of cynicism in theory, right, that it either does nothing, or even worse, that it actually sort of dilutes that third of the voice in the ILO forum. But you've worked in, you've seen this up close and on the ground, and so how does actually the seat at the table translate into power, both in terms of the process of what happens in the ILO and also in terms of the outcomes it produces?
So another excellent question, and one that perhaps might best be answered through illustration. So as I mentioned, USTR has a labor advisory council. So before we would identify what we were going to demand for another country, we would meet with this council confidentially. They're all closed doors, so it's by invite only, and you never hear about them, and I can't tell you the exact details. But what I can tell you is the only people invited were the heads of the big unions, like James Hoffa. They were all there, their pinky rings and smiles. You didn't have a single representative of informal workers. You didn't have a single representative of the downstream workers. You didn't have a representative of the other sectors in the United States that didn't benefit from their representation. And it's funny because we talk about like, well, how do we craft this in marketing terms and stuff? It's already in marketing and capital terms. When they would show up, when the labor unions would show up, they know the language, and their entire goal is to secure advantages for their membership. And I want to be clear, it's not like they would sit down and say, we hate non-union people, like let's hurt them, right? It was never that deliberate, but it was certainly, how can we secure all of these privileges for our members? How can you promise us that you will protect this sector? Even though we know through data that by protecting this sector, we're actually placing the burdens, we're placing the costs downstream on those other sectors that were not represented. So what happens if we invite more to that table? Does it dilute? Maybe. Should it dilute? Maybe. Should there have been an opposing voice at that table saying, hold on, wait a second, we have data showing that the cost borne for helping your one worker is going to hurt 80 of our workers. Should the president have had to think about that? Yes. Would it have made our negotiations more complicated? Of course it would have. Would we have maybe foregone some of those concessions that unions have won? Certainly. But we would have also ensured, we talk a lot about the distributional effects. We would have ensured that the effects of trade were truly distributed, or at least considered. By not having a seat at these tables, we invisibilize these workers. So are there risks of having more counter voices at the table? Of course, right now we only have one voice at the table. What I'm trying to urge is that we open this table and we bring in more voices, particularly those most vulnerable voices that don't benefit from union representation already.
It's a really quick question, and then a quick
Yeah,
answer.
well, we can take one last.
Yeah.
Okay,
It can be quick. I just wanted to ask, how would you choose the representatives of these non-union workers? How would you go about that?
Oh my God, that's another $1 million question. And it's something that actually plagues even the ILO. Because if you think about it, there's always a question of like, do we want to look under the hood? And we're talking in the absence of evidence of corporate unionism or, like we're talking, okay, somebody comes up and they says they're a representative, and how interested are we going to be in this? And there's even questions here in the United States, for instance, for indigenous representatives. So there's a lot of like long-standing cultural practices where the representatives of different indigenous communities are, for instance, always men, or are, certain members of tribes. And a question that has plagued the government is like, do we say, no, your representative is invalid when that is a strong cultural norm? So the same thing happens with labor. There are questions of, well, this country practice has always been that, it doesn't need to be a quorum, and so the ILO tries to find ways of reconciling those tensions, of saying both, we're gonna respect the cultural practices of these very pluralistic countries that we're in, whether it's Korea or Indonesia or Afghanistan. But at the same time, here are some basic parameters that you have to satisfy. You can't be a corporate union. You need to have some form of minimal membership accountability. There are certain procedural guidelines trying to strike the best balance. And always, by the way, keeping an open ear to complaints that the union isn't truly doing a robust job. But beyond those minimal procedural requirements, it really is far more deferential than what we see in the United States, where we make it as hard as possible to unionize.
Thank you.
Okay, we just ran out of time. Thanks a lot for everyone that came, and Sanjay, Ila, Yochai for organizing this, and
Thank you
Desiree,
all.
thank you very much.
Thank you, Dana.
Thanks.